welcome to the Children's and Teen Health Summit. I'm your host, Carla Atherton, founder and director of the Lotus Health Project, lotushealthproject.com, where we empower people to get healthy and stay healthy in mind, body, and spirit, and on the social, global, and environmental levels. For this session of the summit, I'm excited to be speaking with Dr. Dan Siegel about the myths and truths about the teenage brain. Daniel J. Siegel, MD, is currently clinical professor of psychiatry at the UCLA School of Medicine and the founding co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center. He is also the executive director of the Mindsight Institute, which offers online learning and in-person lectures that focus on how the development of mindsight in individuals, families, and communities can be enhanced by examining the interface of human relationships and basic biological processes. Dr. Siegel is an author who has published extensively for the professional audience. He serves as the founding editor for the Norton Professional Series on Interpersonal Neurobiology, which contains over 36 textbooks. Dr. Siegel's books include Mindsight, Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology, The Developing Mind, 2nd edition, The Mindful Therapist, The Mindful Brain, Parenting from the Inside Out with Mary Hartzell, M.Ed., The Whole Brain Child with Tina Payne Bryson, Ph.D., and the New York Times bestseller Brainstorm. His next book is No Drama Discipline with Tina Payne Bryson, Ph.D. He has been invited to lecture for the King of Thailand, Pope John Paul II, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Google University, and TEDx. Welcome to the summit, Dr. Siegel.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, Carla.
It is such a pleasure to have you here. As you might know, I am the mother of 2 teens and a preteen. And so I was just digging into your recent book, Brainstorm, an inside-out guide to the emerging adolescent mind, ages 12 to 24. And I'm just absolutely enthralled by what you're saying, and it's almost like all this stuff that I've been thinking, you just put it into a package. So I talk to my kids like that. You guys do have something to say, tell me, right? And so I love it. I love your work, and I'm so glad to have you with us today.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so there's so much I want to ask you and to talk to you about. So I have to actually really restrain myself and ask you questions that will give our listeners a good outline of your work in the time we have today. So I'm just going to start with, talking about that sort of idea that we already have about the teenager in our media and communities, right? So what we say about teenagers, and they seem to be really, they're misconceptions really. About, that whole thing, teenagers are moody and teenagers are just, bridging the gap. They're whiling their time until they become adults. They're, hard to deal with. They're difficult. You're going to have trouble. Ooh, watch the teen years, right? All that stuff that they're unpleasant. And it's quite disrespectful. So a large part of your most recent work is to dispel these myths. So would you go through what these myths are, what you have identified as myths that we have about our teenagers at this present time, and then give us a little bit about why they're untrue?
Absolutely. Well, Carla, what's really fascinating is, in countries all around the world, in Canada, in the United States, in European countries, in Japan, in Australia, literally all around the world, parents have this common belief about adolescence that it's a period of immaturity.
Yeah.
And it's so widely held that even as I'm saying it, I'm sure a number of your listeners will be saying, well, of course it's a period of immaturity.
Yeah.
It's a time of growing up, and isn't that immaturity? So the problem with the first myth, that adolescence is a period of immaturity, is it has embedded in it a belief on both adults' parts and the part of the adolescent themselves that, okay, where I'm at right now is just waiting to become something else. Mm-hmm. That there's nothing really about this that's good. I'm just immature. In fact, even the word adolescent, at least in the United States, I don't know if it's this way in Canada, is an insult. If you want to say to someone you're acting irresponsibly and immaturely and you're being impulsive, and this is no good, you got to grow up, all these signs of immaturity, this is what you say, oh,
Yeah.
how adolescent of you, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the first myth is actually adolescence is a necessary period of growth that has certain essential features to it that are in and of themselves important, and they're not just waiting to become something else.
Right.
And when we back off from the myth and look at the truth, that in fact the what's called reconstruction of the adolescent brain is not just some waiting period to become something else because you're immature and you need to be mature. Rather, there's some very important changes that allow new skills to be acquired during the adolescent period, not just waiting for that period to be over.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first myth, that, oh, adolescence is a period of immaturity. No, it's a period of opportunity that gives us great chances to develop ourselves well when we are the adolescents, or to support the development of individuals during that time of life.
Mm-hmm. Lovely way to look at it. I love that. Yeah, so it's not a way station. We're not just waiting
It's
to be
not a
something
way
else.
station.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it'd be like saying, hey, you know, hopefully you'll be one day 80 years old and a senior citizen. So if you're 30 or 40 or 50 or 60, you're just immature.
Yeah.
Well, no.
And that really, and that's true too, because that really affects how we see our own human development and where we're at certain points in our lives, right? Because it's always like this waiting to become. So we really like skip over what's right in our face right now, right? So it's almost like
That's
it
right.
feeds into our hurry, get there. And there's no there, really. It's the process.
Exactly. Exactly. In fact, that's a second myth we should lead into.
Sure.
Which is, adolescence is a period that is so horrible, or horrible, depending on how you say it, so bad that you should just get through it as fast as possible. Keep your fingers crossed, hope it works out okay, and just get through it.
Yeah.
Which is exactly what you're saying. The second myth gives adolescents and adults a feeling of anxiety. Like, oh my gosh. I mean, how many parents do you know, Carla, where their kids are about to become teenagers and they go, oh my God, I'm dreading it so much. Now it's understandable. There are risks about that we can talk about, but to have the attitude like it's a time of life to just get over as fast as possible is a myth that makes everyone lose sight of the incredibly powerful purpose of this period of life. And that we'll talk about later, but the myth basically is that, you just got to get through it fast. Instead, what we need to do is cultivate the essence of adolescence to optimize how we live, not just as adolescents, but actually as adults too.
Right. Yes. And so, I mean, I don't know if you were thinking about talking about this later as well, but it just makes me think about what you're saying is making me think about that question we always ask our teens, adolescents, whatever, that, what are you going to be? Right? What are you going to be when you're done your schooling or your high school? What are you going to be when you grow up? Shouldn't we be asking them, how are you now? Because they are something already.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. How is life for you now? Tell me about you now. And that whole idea of planning for the future is good in the sense of, it's a part of being here and now is also saying, I'm studying this and preparing myself this and developing that skill. So there's nothing wrong with that. But when it's only aiming for the future and not focusing on the present, then that leaves out a huge amount of life.
Yes. Okay, so let's move on. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No. So we can move on to a third myth.
Yeah, sure.
And a third myth is that the adolescent period is a time where adolescents make risks because they're impulsive. So now that's a partially true statement. In the early teenage years, an impulse turns into an action without thought much more readily than in later years. However, the risk that is true in adolescents in general are 3 times more likely than at earlier periods of life or later to have a preventable, serious event that leads to permanent harm or even death. So the sad truth is that, adolescence is a time when, even though the body is stronger than it ever will be. So, for example, if you're going to have an infection, you ought to get it during adolescence because your body can fight it off better than a child can and better than an adult can. So it's a strong body, but yet accidents that lead to permanent physical harm or events that are preventable that lead to death, like suicide and like accidents and like murder, are 3 times more likely. Now, why are these risky things happening? Well, in early teenage years, it is true, impulsivity is a problem. But it turns out that impulsivity, which stops for the most part by mid-teenage years, which is the middle of adolescence, basically. The next myth we'll talk about is about what this adolescent period is, but we'll get to that next. But during this period of time, you have something else going on that's called hyper-rational thinking. That's one thing. And the other thing is changes in the reward circuit of the brain that's governed by a neurochemical called dopamine. And basically changes in the baseline levels and release levels of dopamine make it so that an adolescent is driven to go away from the familiar, which is useful if you're trying to get ready to leave home and be out in the world.
Sure.
Not to abandon your parents, but just to get ready to be out in the world. And it also drives you to try new things because the home is familiar. You want new things. So this change in dopamine of a drop in baseline levels and increase in release levels, essentially, what it does is it makes you want new things. And part of that is to drive you toward risky things. So one aspect of risk is the dopamine change in the reward system. The second aspect is hyper-rational thinking, where the reasoning part of your brain basically puts more emphasis on the thrilling sides of a choice. Like, if I'm going to drive really fast, how exciting would that be? And especially, how cool would it be for me to impress my friends? And whether they're watching or we'll just hear about it later on, they'll think, oh, Dan is so awesome. He drove 100 miles an hour, and that gets adolescents to do riskier things when they think that their friends, their colleagues, their peers are watching, or if they'll hear about it later on. So hyper-rational thinking, really is the way you rationalize how doing something that's dangerous is okay. That's where the word comes from. And what it means is you're overemphasizing your interest in the risk-free part, like it's just going to be so exciting, and you de-emphasize your interest in the risk part, which is I could get hurt, I could hurt someone else, things like that.
Okay. I think that is extremely interesting because, that impulsivity, we can tend to correlate that with stupidity, right? Like, why are you doing that? That's just dumb. What? I don't get that. And so, to really know that that's actually how what their brains are actually, telling them to do, like, through the reward center, that is just awesome. And I think about a lot of people that I went to school with in high school that were extremely impulsive and did some really quote unquote stupid things, right? So this really explains a lot. It explains a lot,
right.
Dr. Siegel.
So they may have been impulsive.
Yes.
But you may also have friends who actually planned out things that were
so did.
Outrageous. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now that's a hyper-rational dopamine system working together. So they're not impulsive. An impulsive thing is, I didn't think about it, I just did it.
Yeah.
Someone can take months planning an outrageously dangerous thing that turns out really badly, and it was planned out. So it wasn't impulsive, it was hyper-rational and dopamine driven.
Got it. Okay, you said you had more myths.
Yeah. So another myth is that adolescence, of course, we're saying is a period of immaturity. It's a time when you should just get through it, that it's really impulsivity. The fourth myth we're going to talk about is that adolescence is a period of time you should just grow out of.
Right.
Right? Because you're going to become an adult. Well, there's actually an essence to the core changes in the brain during the adolescent period that if we try to just get over it and not actually try to cultivate those during adolescence, and even, here's the key thing to this myth, even hold on to them in adulthood, then we're not going to optimize either the adolescent period or the adult period. So one of the reasons that I wrote the book Brainstorm for both adolescents and adults to read was that it wasn't just for adolescents to try to optimize their adolescent period, which it can do, but adults who read it go, oh my gosh, I think I took on that myth. I dumped all the things that happened to me during adolescence, and now I'm left, and here's the essence, these 4 elements that actually spell the word essence. ES is an emotional spark. So the adolescent brain, when puberty begins somewhere between 10 and 14 usually, so around 12, so it's basically adolescence begins around puberty. It can be actually happening even before puberty, and it can happen even after puberty. So it's not exactly the same, but it's a rough estimate.
Okay.
It begins after the first dozen years of life. That's an average to really aim for. And it lasts, this is another 5th myth, if you will, it lasts well into the mid to late 20s.
Okay.
Now, what is it that's lasting? What's lasting is that the brain is becoming remodeled. And what that means is 2 things are happening. It's like a reconstruction site. You're building on the foundation of the first 12 years, and you're taking away parts you don't need. That's called pruning, like pruning in a garden, taking away the extra parts of the plants. And then you're reinforcing those that remain. And that has a term, it's a scientific term in the brain. When you want to reinforce connected basic cells called neurons, you encase a very healthy conducting sheath that allows them to communicate 3,000 times quicker and more coordinated. And that's called myelin. So this second one is pruning. The other thing is myelination, laying down myelin. So basically, the adolescent period is a period of pruning and laying down myelin that essentially can be called remodeling, that makes the brain more integrated. It means you differentiate by pruning away parts you don't need, and then you link by myelin. And that whole remodeling period goes on to the mid-20s. So if you wanted just to rough it out, you'd say it's the second dozen years of life. So adolescence is not the same as teenage years. So that's another misconception. But coming back to our point, the emotional spark, the first part of essence, ES, of essence is emotional spark. The adolescent brain is more emotional. And, the reason for that is motions get you to move, and you got to be able to move on in life. So you have to be a little more emotional. The downside, each of these have a reason, a downside, and an upside. And the idea is, how do you optimize the upside, minimize the downside, and recognize the reason? The reason is to get you to move. The downside is you can be moody and irritable and not depend on your own emotional life. The upside is you can learn to surf those emotions so that life is balanced and the emotions remain high so that life has vitality. Too often, adults have let go of their emotional spark and they feel that life is boring, that it's lost its luster, and they kind of, I think in some ways, long for the excitement of the adolescent emotional life.
Right.
So that's the first thing, ES, emotional spark.
Okay.
The next one is, if we spell the word essence, ES, the next is SE, social engagement. Adolescents are driven by changes in the remodeling brain to have more dependence on their peers than their parents. The reason for this is that for all mammals, when you leave the nest, you need to associate with peers in order to survive. We, as human beings, are mammals. So we've inherited this fact of adolescence that we need our peers to survive. It may be just one peer, like one best friend, or maybe a group of peers. The reason for it is survival.
Mm-hmm.
The downside is it's so important that you can give up morality for membership.
Ooh.
And that's called peer pressure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the downside. If we teach adolescents about this, at least they can understand it. And parents knowing about this can honor the desperate feeling an adolescent may have. I need those boots. I need that jacket. I need to go to that party. You don't have to get the boots or jacket or let them go to the party necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to honor the feeling of life and death quality, that if my peer group doesn't accept me, it feels like I'm going to die, because they've inherited that from millions of years of evolution. If I don't have membership with a peer group in adolescence, I'm as good as dead.
Wow. That's very profound. Like that one, I like to just stop there, let that one sink in, because that's another thing we think, you should just be able to resist. But there's actually this evolutionary, hardwired desire for that. It's not just our day and age and what a kid, kids just want to fit in and and that's such a bad thing, But so I think that's just essential. That's a great point, Dr. Siegel.
Yeah. Well, Carla, I mean, this is, the excitement of sharing this with everybody is, when we become aware of this essence, as we'll see, it helps us honor the adolescent period of life.
Mm-hmm.
It also allows us as adults to realize, hey, I don't really give enough energy to my social engagement, my relationships. Mm-hmm. And yet every piece of research shows that the number one predictor of your medical health, your mental health, how long you live, and your happiness are your social connections.
Yeah. Wow.
So this social engagement is something we learn in adolescence, but we shouldn't let it go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Okay, so the N?
The N, exactly. The N is novelty. So novelty is, with the changes in dopamine we talked about, your brain seeks the unfamiliar, the novel, the new.
Mm-hmm.
And, the reason for this is the brain basically needs you to get out of the comfort of your familiar home. I mean, the home can be very comfortable, very certain, very predictable, very familiar, very safe. So take the opposite of all that, and that's what it means to leave the home. I need to be drawn somehow to the unfamiliar, not the familiar. The uncomfortable, not the comfortable. The uncertain, not the certain. And potentially the unsafe, because it's unsafe out there compared to home, usually for most kids. So here's the story then. Novelty seeking, this N of essence, is what drives the adolescent to get ready to be out in the world. Doesn't mean you have to reject your parents or reject your home, but it means you're seeking more than just the familiarity of the home. Mm-hmm. That's true in every culture. So here's where we need to realize, well, if that's the reason, is there a downside to it? And we've already described the downside. The change in dopamine and the change in this hyper-rational way of thinking makes it so novelty seeking has the danger of risk that you're going to get hurt. And as we said, that's a real risk. That's not a parent's paranoia. It's actually, any adolescent listening to this should know, it's actually a real concern. So what we want to do is inform adolescents rather than just threaten them and imprison them. We want to inform them and invite them to join in on this time of life, because it's necessary to have novelty seeking, but we need to help them think clearly about their own hyper-rational thinking, and that we can do once we understand what it is. So that's the novelty. What's the upside of it? Life is full of energy and vitality and freshness when you're not just doing the same old all the time. And actually, if you look at studies of the brain loves to grow when it's given new experiences. So our brains grow throughout our lifespan, and it's not just in adolescence we should be seeking novelty. As adults, to keep our brains young, we not only should have an emotional spark and social engagement, but we should also be seeking new ways of doing things. And that's important in adulthood as much as it is in adolescence. But so many adults have gotten into a rut They feel life is just a repeating pattern of now dull and boring things. And it doesn't have to be that way. It does not have to be that way. You, as an adult, can keep this novelty-seeking element of the essence of adolescence alive in your life. And you can keep that for a lifetime. And, people do, you probably look at them, Carla, and you say, that person seems so young, even though they're 80 years old. That's because they kept their inner adolescent alive and well in their outer life.
Yes. So the C and the E.
Yes. So CE is creative exploration. And what this is that the adolescent mind is driven to push against the status quo. And you say, well, what's the reason for that? There's two big reasons for our population as a human family. Think about it this way. We go through adolescence and find our niche as an adult, doing this particular job, raising kids, whatever we do. We have a specific role we take on as adults. We've adapted to the world that we grew up in. Now, adults get pretty clear in what their role is. They get very specialized in what they do, and that's fine. But the world is forever changing. So if you had life go just from childhood, where you're sponging in the world of knowledge and skills of adults, and went straight to adulthood and got your niche, we would never be adaptive as a species. And even as an individual, the second part, the personal benefit of this creative exploration, we would just be stuck with whatever we're handed. So for individual adaptation to a changing world, and for our whole human family, I believe very deeply, and the research hints at this, that the reason the human species is so profoundly adaptive, we have inhabited every corner of this planet, for good or for bad, but it's just a trait we have. I believe the reason we have so much ingenuity and adaptability is because of adolescence. You see, children leave their adolescence, and creative exploration is they want to push against the status quo. Adults say, okay, this is the way it is. And a teenager, and then a later adolescent in their 20s, they're designed, they don't always take advantage of it, but they're designed to say, hey, I hear you tell me it's A and B and C, but you know something? I think X, Y, and Z is possible too, and I'm going to try it out. So they make, for example, social media made by adolescents, advances in art, adolescents, advances in music, in science, and as we're saying, in technology. All these areas, the predominant contribution comes from adolescent minds. So, I believe, the reason for it is this adaptability. What's the downside? Well, it can feel kind of disorienting to go from childhood, where you depended on assuming everything the adults were handing you was cool and great and the best it could be. And then as an adolescent, you go, something, I don't think my parents are the gods I thought they were. I don't think they're the heroes I thought they were. Something, I'm kind of disappointed and angry at them. They're like letting me down. And so that's an understandable downside. You're disoriented and disillusioned.
Yeah.
At an extreme, of course, it can be really depressing and demoralizing. So that's the downside. The upside is, the excitement of trying something new and creating new things, of thinking outside the box, and literally entering the world with that kind of energy and willingness to try on new things and courage. So creative exploration is something that we actually should honor in the adolescent. Their drive for novelty, we need to honor it. Their social engagement, we need to honor it. Instead of making them competitive with each other in schools, let's teach them to build on their natural propensity to be collaborative, but we don't usually do that. An emotional spark, we need to let them pursue their passions rather than dump them. So, I'm getting a bunch of educators together in November in New York, where we're going to we're rethinking the school system. We're going to have this wonderful gathering on innovation and education, and I'll be running the program on adolescence, because we're going to try to collect our minds together, literally to brainstorm together about how we might take these brainstorm ideas of the essence of adolescence and rethink what middle school, high school, and perhaps even college can be.
Wow. That's amazing. What you just talked about there, that to me spells life, really. I mean,
Yeah,
the
it's
spark
the
of
essence of
life.
life.
It is. And yeah, I think that's such an important space to, I mean, that's where I find myself the most, like the happiest actually, is when I'm feeling that kind of creative passion. And, to be able to pull that out and feel young. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why, and I'm not sure if you feel the same way, Dr. Siegel, is that I so enjoy working with adolescents,
Yeah.
people at that age level. And just
Well, they can be our great teachers, you know?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. So I just find that highly inspiring. So just to put that in a nutshell, your definition of the essence of teenhood would be emotional spark, social engagement, novelty, and creative exploration.
That's correct.
In a
That's the
nutshell.
essence of adolescence. It's the
Oh,
essence
sorry,
of
essence of
adolescence, as you're,
adolescence.
yeah, and what you're beautifully pointing out is it's also the essence of living a vital life at any age.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Wonderful. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more of the science. Okay, so I know that you touched on quite a few issues dealing with the chemistry of the brain and what's going on during adolescence. But could you kind of give us a little bit of a rundown of how the brain grows and what's happening in the adolescent brain?
Sure. Well, think about it this way. The first dozen years of life, which is childhood,
Mm-hmm.
is a time where the basic cells of the brain, the neurons, are both genetically programmed to link up with each other and shaped by experience that basically is soaking in our interactions with other people, the way we focus our attention, the skills we learn. So we learn facts, we learn basically knowledge about the world, we learn skills, and this is all fantastic ways that children are open to acquiring what adults have to offer them. They also learn from their peers, of course, and this is basically the story of preschool and of elementary school and the beginning of middle school.
Mm-hmm.
When adolescence begins, roughly around the time of puberty, so there's sexual maturation, and at that time there's changes in the dopamine circuitry. Another process also is happening inside the skull, and that's the process we were talking about of remodeling.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an increase in what's called pruning, of carving away those connections among neurons, which are called synapses, and even neurons themselves that are not used. So what I say to adolescents when I teach in middle schools and high schools, I say, look, this is really up to you. If you want to develop just the part of your brain that controls your right hand to move a mouse with a video game over and over and over again, you do that. But the parts of your brain that might learn how to interact with other people face to face in conversations, the part of your brain that might love to do an athletic sport or to learn a foreign language or to play a musical instrument, one that might learn to dance, all these skills that you could develop are going to be harder to develop after adolescence is done. Because your brain is basically saying, what am I doing and how should I build the circuitry of my brain during this pruning period? That usually gets people, their eyes will get wide open. I said, it's a use it or lose it principle. And I said, no one can do it but you. No adult can tell you how to focus your attention. It's up to you. And they usually listen up, and I say, so let's talk about what kind of brain circuits you want to develop. And that's basically the pruning part. Now, you want to prevent the pruning away of areas that you'd like to keep.
Right.
And the pollinating part is just strengthening. Then with practice, you take those circuits that are being used, and with focused practice, you actually can strengthen the connections and lay down myelin. So it's a win-win thing. It empowers the adolescent, taking the fight between an adult and adolescent out of the family situation or even out of the school situation, and it empowers the adolescents. This is this is what's so exciting for me as an educator, to have the Brainstorm book out there and to have taken the time. It's the hardest book I ever wrote, to write a book for adolescents. It doesn't exist, a book for adolescents to teach them about their brain. There was nothing like that. And there was no book written for both generations, adult and adolescent, both, to read. And after I wrote it, I understand why. It was the hardest thing I've ever written. To get, because I had to send it out to adolescents to read. I got their very painful feedback to me. Don't talk like this, don't do that, don't do that. And I changed it based on the recommendation. I sent it out again, got the feedback again, sent it out again, until it got to be what it is, which is this book that adolescents are, gobbling up. So, that was because of what they taught me.
Yeah.
And so this idea of understanding the way the brain functions, the way it's changing during adolescence, empowers you as an adolescent or you as an adult to actually use your mind to optimize basically how the brain is trying to remodel itself, which is towards something called integration. So in the book, there are these exercises called Mindsight skill building exercise. Mindsight is a word I made meaning how do you see the mind? So when you learn to see the mind in yourself or others, you actually build very important circuitry in the brain that enhances the quality of your life during adolescence and beyond.
Okay. And so are you referring to the Mindsight Simple 7?
Well, that's at the end of the book, but before that, way before that, there's Mindsight skill exercises throughout the book. That's at the end. I refer to these neuroplasticity studies that David Rock and I summarized in a little graph we have called the Healthy Mind Platter. And that's just coming straight from the science. So it's nothing fancy, but it makes it accessible. These simple 7 things you can do every day are things that you can access in your daily life.
Okay, so let's come back to that. But let's go to where you were going before with these exercises. And so can you give an example of what, how adolescents can prune in a I don't know what you'd call, like a positive way, or in a way that they, to, I guess, fulfill what their goals are with how they would like to prune their brains? Like, what's something they can do?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So absolutely. So one thing is, and this does relate to the Simple 7, get good sleep.
Interesting.
Sleep.
Yeah.
Sleep. So important. And most adolescents I talk to are sleep deprived.
Oh, yeah.
An adolescent needs about 9 hours of sleep, 8 to 9 hours of sleep. How many adolescents do you know during the school week, and you can't catch up on the weekend? It doesn't work like that. How many do you know are getting those hours of sleep?
Yeah.
Most of them, they have lots of work. It's not their fault, but so much homework activities. They go to bed around midnight. They got to get up around 6. That's 6 hours of sleep.
Yeah. Yeah, and some of them are
2 to 3 hours, not enough.
Yeah. That's a lot. A lot of them are kind of night owls as well, or spending, time with their friends until 3 a.m. on the weekends and stuff like that. It's almost like a culturally, acceptable to just be up so late and then got to drag your butt to school in the morning.
Right. Well, here's what it's like. Dragging your butt is right. Here's what sleep deprivation does. It makes it so your immune system doesn't function so well, so you're more likely to get infections. It makes it so that your hormonal metabolism doesn't work well with insulin, so you're more likely to get overweight and not eat well and metabolize your food properly. It makes it more likely so you can't focus attention, so it's hard to really keep your attention on schoolwork, for example. It makes it so you can't remember as well, and it makes it so you're more irritable. So what in all of that is good?
Yeah. Yeah, and I know what it's like to be irritable.
Yeah.
Not fun to be around.
It's not fun to be for others, and it affects your relationship. So
yes.
Now, let's not put the blame on adolescents,
right.
Alone, because it's hard. There's so much schoolwork. There's so much pressure. So this has to be a system-wide effort. And it is true that some studies, not all, but some studies suggest that, the way the adolescent brain has its rhythms are such that you are, as an adolescent, going to go to sleep later. and want to wake up later.
Mm-hmm.
But schools start early as if you're an adult. So if you go to sleep later and you have to wake up like an adult, you're not going to get enough sleep.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing. Second thing is that electronic means, screens of your smartphone, your tablet, your laptop, your
Yep.
desk computer, even if you sit too close to a TV,
Mm-hmm.
all these sources of light wake up the brain.
Mm-hmm.
So there's, a sleep hygiene rule that I talk about in the book of, turning the lights off as much as you can, dimming lights, an hour before you have to go to sleep. But people don't do that. They're working on their computers all the time. Do the homework that requires a computer and being on the internet early in the day,
Mm-hmm.
not late at night. Read a book with just a light bulb that's not directly beaming into your eyes.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, for example, I've made a rule for myself, because this isn't just true with adolescents. All those things are true with adults. And we may need a teeny bit less, but mostly it's about 7 to 8 hours for an adult of sleep we need. And a lot of adults don't get that. So for myself, I by 9 o'clock, I don't have any digital objects that are on. It's just a rule.
Yeah, me neither.
And I try to dim down the lights, and that's,
Yeah.
otherwise I can't.
Yeah.
So sleep is one thing. Exercise is another thing.
Mm-hmm.
Moving the body around. We sit too much. We're on these digital objects way too much, even just for the sitting aspect of things. Our bodies are meant to move, and we are not moving enough. And exercise, moving the body around, doesn't have to be, a painful thing where, I got to exercise. Just motion. Keep your body in motion, and that actually keeps your brain growing well. In terms of your question, Carla, about the pruning,
Mm-hmm.
this is the best thing you can do for your brain is move your body.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't
Sleep.
relate those things to it, right? Sleep and moving, that it's good for your brain.
It's good for your brain.
Yeah.
I mean, and eating well. A third thing, I don't include that in the Simple Mindsight 7 because it's, something that's a large topic. What should you be eating? But people are eating way too much high glycemic foods.
Yeah.
That is, foods that turn to glucose in your blood instantly, basically, very rapidly. And
Mhm.
those lead to inflammation and all sorts of problems. But the problem we've just discovered is that high glycemic foods, things like bread and potato chips and stuff like that, that quickly go in your stomach, turn to sugar in your blood, those are addicting.
Mm-hmm.
Soda, addicting,
Mm-hmm.
And what that means is that you crave them. Your body longs for them. It needs them. And until you get them, you feel, so really frustrated. I really want it. So, that's another very important thing in terms of brain health.
Yeah.
You don't need the inflammation that high glycemic foods cause.
Yeah. And the interesting thing that it just seems like that's the culturally accepted diet of our adolescents, of that
That's right.
time period, right? We'll just eat junk and
Yeah,
pizza.
you go to colleges. I mean, you just go to a university setting, and it's just a lot. For most universities that I've been to, there's just a lot of junk. And you can say, oh, well, they like to eat that. Well, that doesn't matter. That's not the issue. They like to eat it because now we know it's addicting.
Yeah.
They like to eat it, So this is a serious problem I don't know how it is in Canada, but in the United States, a third of the population has developed obesity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This is a serious problem. So anyway, so that's the food part of it. Another thing is, just your relationships.
Mm-hmm.
People are not spending enough time face to face. You can call it connecting time, connecting with other people, even connecting with the planet and nature. That's another part of connecting. You want to be face to face with other human beings and face to face with nature.
Mm-hmm.
And we just don't do that enough. And it activates so many wonderful things in the brain when you're with friends that you can trust and when you're with nature.
Yeah.
So, these are just some of the 7, and I'm bringing them up because you asked about it. But there are exercises you can do. I teach, we also have something called focus time, which is how you focus your attention, and as well as something called downtime, which is just relaxing and not having anything to do, just hanging loose And then another one is playtime, to be goofy, playful, spontaneous. And I don't mean you're engaged in a sport, which would be more like, physical time, where you're competing with people and trying to beat them. I mean where you're playfully, spontaneously, supportively engaging with other people in a way that usually involves laughter, which is so important, and just having fun. That's playtime. And then the final one is something called time in, which is relates to a lot of the mindset skills we learned earlier in the book. And what those are basically times to reflect inwardly on what's going on with your feelings, your thoughts, your memories. And we have something called the Wheel of Awareness practice, where adolescents are doing it with wonderful feedback we're getting from the many adolescents who are doing it, who have written to us that it's changed their life, to give them an understanding of how their minds work, of giving them a way not just to understand it, but to actually strengthen their minds.
Wow. Yeah. And all those things that you just mentioned, Dr. Siegel, are really things that take a lot, like just time and space. You need time and space to do any of those things. And I think that, a lot of adolescents, and actually just us, in general, and at least in our, Western culture, don't have a lot of that, or haven't set aside enough time and space.
That's right. We just don't. And this is the idea of literally, this is the beautiful thing about, having people know about this is you actually are empowered now with this knowledge to set the time and space of your day. Or just lay it out. Sleeping well, exercising well, having focus time where you're not distracted, having downtime where you're just hanging out, right? Having time in where you're reflecting on the inner world, having playtime,
Yeah.
all of these things that we can do, connecting with other people and nature. These are things you can plan into your day. And when you name it, you can tame it, is the way I like to say it, so that you can literally say, I can tame a day. I can take on what feels sometimes overwhelming. How do I keep myself healthy and strong? But actually, the road to doing it, once you see what it is pretty workable.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Okay, so earlier throughout this whole interview, you've mentioned relationships a few times and how they're an immense part of our humanity, especially during this time of adolescence. So, our relationships even shape our sense of self and identity. Can you explain this a little further?
Yeah, it's one of three parts of the core of being human, if you will. We have what goes on inside of our bodies, and a lot of people are very interested, as we've been talking about today, in the brain part of the body. But the brain sits in the whole body, and that's extremely important. And when you look at our mental lives, the second part, the idea of your feelings and thoughts and how you focus attention, your consciousness, what you do with your beliefs, your intentions, your hopes, your dreams, all that is part of the mind. The second part of the core of life, this is dependent in part on what goes on in your body, including your brain, but it's also equally part of your connection to other people and even your connection with the planet. So let's just use the word relationship for how your bodily self is interacting with a relational self, if you will. Now, what does that mean, a relational self? What that means is that it isn't just that you are separate and live in a body. It means that the mind, and this is what I've been teaching since 1992, so how many years that is, that the mind is not just brain activity, even though that's a common statement from neuroscientists. I think it's a partially true statement. The mind is not just brain activity, it's the whole body. And then the mind is not just within us, it's also between us. And so right now, Carla, between me and you, our minds are melding and they're being connected in the communication that defines our relationship. So if you and I were being hostile toward each other, or disrespectful and unkind, unempathic, uninterested, all these unwords, the tone of this whole conversation would be different. And the mind that was created between us, that we're both sharing right now and sharing with anyone listening, would have a very different quality. So it isn't even what social neuroscientists will say is, oh, the brain is a social organ, meaning it's sensitive to social signals. What I'm suggesting is that the mind isn't just brain activity that happens to be sensitive to social input. The mind is created in relationships as much as it's created within the body, including the brain. So this view is a little different from what you'll hear from mainline scientists, but all of my scientific writing is to try to reinforce what I think is a larger truth, which is that the mind is both embodied, not just enskulled, and in addition to being embodied, it's relational. This is where, for me, the mind is both within and between. You could say, well, how in the world could it be that way? And this is a long line of reasoning, but let me just give you the take-home punchline to the joke. It goes like this. When you look at something called a system, systems are defined by the interaction of basic elements. And for me, the element of the mind that is most useful to identify is energy, and some of that energy is in the form of symbolism we call information. So to be complete, we would say that the mind is comprised of energy and information flow, and that the arising of this flow happens not just within the brain, but it goes through the whole body. And lo and behold, it isn't just happening within the body, it's happening in our relationships with each other and the planet. And so then you say, okay, so if the system is energy and information flow, which is what I'm saying, and what kind of system is it? And through a line of reasoning, we say it has the mathematical term, it's a complex system. That just means it's nonlinear, it's open, and it's capable of being chaotic. And I think most people agree your mental life is like that. Now, nonlinear means small inputs lead to large and unpredictable results. Open means it's influenced from outside of itself. And chaos capable means it can be randomly distributed. That's the simplest way of saying it. Now, it turns out that complex systems have what are called emergent properties, properties that arise as the interactions of the elements happen. And one of those properties is called self-organization. So for me, the most useful way of understanding mind is as the embodied and relational self-organizing emergent process that regulates energy and information flow. And so we look to ways to strengthen regulation, and it turns out through a long line of reasoning I talk about in all my books, integration is the heart of a well-organized mind. So integration is the linkage of differentiated parts, and when it's a system that's complex is integrating itself through self-organization, it creates the most harmonious flow. It's the most flexible and adaptive. It has the mathematical quality of coherence, meaning it holds together well, fluidly over time. It's energized and it's stable. That spells an acronym I enjoy called FACES, flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. This FACES flow is equivalent to harmony. So all that being said, the reason relationships are so important is because they are half of what creates the mind. I don't mean shapes the mind. I mean what creates the mind. So the mind is both relational and embodied. And knowing both those sides of human reality, for example, for understanding adolescence, gives us a huge ability to deeply understand how to support the healthy growth of adolescence during adolescence, and even as adults, getting back our adolescent mind with its emotional spark, social engagement, novelty seeking, and creative exploration. This is how literally we can relationally, like what you and I are doing right now, Carla, get communication out there so people can be really inspired to rewire their brains toward integration. And everything in the Brainstorm book, for example, is all about promoting integration for the reader, whether the reader is an adult or an adolescent.
Okay, so help me to translate what you just said about relationships into how that turns into our sense of self, or helps to inform our brains as to what our sense of self and identity might be. Like, yeah, is it because of how we, interrelate with other people that sort of becomes part of who we are as people, as human beings, or am I? Help me get there.
Sure. Well, this is a wonderful question you're asking, and you're asking it in such a helpful way. I think the best way to describe it is this. People have mistaken the skin as the boundary of the self.
Mm-hmm.
And they meaning scientists, they meaning the general public, they meaning parents, they meaning educators, most of us have said, oh, like, for example, Carla lives in your body and Dan lives in this body.
Mm-hmm.
When, in fact, there's no reason, I want to suggest to you, to limit the self to the skin.
Yeah.
So that makes the self a kind of noun when you limit it to the skin. Mm-hmm. I think the self is a verb.
Mm.
And if anything, it's a plural verb, even though I know that doesn't make any sense. It's a thing that's emerging. So that's the verb quality of it. And in this emergence, the way I say at the end of the Brainstorm book to the reader is I say, look, of course you have a me that lives in that body you're inhabiting. And that me has developed a history of everything you experienced in that body. Mm-hmm. But you also have a sense of self as a we that is so under-recognized and so unsupported in modern culture that people are so anxious, they're so upset, they're so overwhelmed because I think in part they've misplaced the self by sticking it only in the body. So people are lonely and sad and feel forlorn. They feel there's no hope. They feel something is wrong and they can't articulate it. For me, understanding that the self, which is coming from the mind, mm-hmm. is both embodied. Yes, you have a me, but relational, you have a we, really brings up the idea, well, how do you make an integrated identity? So for me, and I say this in the book, it comes out to not just me and not just we, but if you combine them, you get we,
right.
MWE. And I think that if we as a culture started to support the development of an integrated identity as a we, not only would the individual experience a lot more well-being and clarity and health,
yeah,
but the world itself would begin to transform because of that transformation of our awareness that we is the integrated identity where, for example, you honor each other's differences and you promote linkages, where you're kind because in this integrated state, you're honoring and supporting each other's vulnerability.
Yeah.
And where you actually have what's called empathic joy, where someone else is successful and doing well and you feel great and want to support them. Think about a world where all we did was support each other and our growth as a collective human family. That's the way we need to turn human cultural evolution around.
Beautiful sentiment. I had one more question. We only have a couple of minutes left, and it's a huge question. So I'm going to throw it out there to you, Dr. Siegel, and see what you make of it. So, adolescence is a time, of great change and that we've been talking about, and very special. And so, but it doesn't come without its challenges, right? So,
yep.
What would you identify as maybe just some of them and how to navigate, these challenges?
Well, that's, one of the main reasons I wrote Brainstorm as a book and wrote it for adults and wrote it for adolescents both.
Okay.
Was for exactly this question, Carla. So the whole book is devoted to answering that question.
Okay.
So I would say in short, if you look at each of the downsides of the essence, the emotional spark being irritability, then learning to understand your inner life of emotions as an adolescent is crucial. And yet we hardly have anything going on in schools or even at home, our busy home life, that provides that internal education is what I would call it. So the emotional spark, the downsides can be really minimized and the upsides maximized by an internal education, which the Brainstorm book provides, and I hope schools will start teaching this internal education. Number two, social engagement. We have it all flipped wrong. In schools, we're really encouraging people to compete with each other, beat each other out, get better grade point averages, better standardized test scores, get into the most competitive college so you can what? Get in the most competitive graveyard? I mean, this competition is just driving people mad because there's an essential collaborative nature of the adolescent that is completely being obliterated by the educational world they're in and the world at large. So this is a lose-lose situation. You can get motivated by collaboration. You don't have to try to beat someone out to try to be best. So that's that one. For novelty, in addition to the risks we talked about, there's also the risk of drug use and drug abuse and drug addiction.
Yeah.
Because every drug of addiction is based on dopamine. And because of these changes, you do have risks for the misuse of substances that alter the way the mind functions. So in that sense, we need to be very aware of what those risks are and handle them with an open mind and understand the drive to try drugs, but the risk of doing so, especially with abuse and addiction. Another thing we should say in terms of you're asking a very specific question about risks is because of the pruning of the brain. Unfortunately, adolescence is the most common time for a serious psychiatric disorder to emerge. So if you're going to develop something like a anxiety disorder or eating disorder or a mood disorder like depression or manic depressive illness called bipolar disorder, or even schizophrenia where your thoughts become disintegrated. All of these I feel are examples of impaired integration in the brain, and that you can see in a book called Mindsight or The Developing Mind. But for the purposes of your question, what I hope will happen, and there's some studies at Stanford University and related studies at UCLA, to see if you can use mind training practices to build the integrative functioning and structure of the brain so that as the pruning occurs, you're actually targeting the integrative fibers of the brain that may be at risk in the development of these various disorders. So what I provided for in the book were integrative exercises that ideally, if they're practiced in schools and at home, that if everyone did them, we actually might see a decrease in the onset of psychiatric disorders if, in fact, these studies at UCLA and Stanford and other places turn out to be true, that you can actually alter the natural course of the emergence of a psychiatric disorder through, for example, mindfulness meditation training. Research isn't in yet, but all the science suggests it's likely going to be true because of studies of neuroplasticity and studies of meditation training. So we just have to see. But in the meantime, developing these integrative practices can be very helpful. So that's another thing. I think that there's very specific things that can be done. We have to support the creative exploration that's inherent in adolescence. And I think by working together, as we'll do in November, to rethink the adolescent educational experience, I'm very hopeful that we can really shape the future because adolescents are our future.
Oh, lovely. I'm going to leave it at that. I have so many more questions for you, but for another time, Dr. Siegel.
Thank you, Carla. It's a pleasure.
Wonderful. And so your book, Brainstorm, An Inside-Out Guide to the Emerging Adolescent Mind, is absolutely amazing. I, for one, am going to have both of my teenagers read it and my third one read it when she's ready. Well, at least I will encourage them to do so.
Yes.
Your institute is called the Mindsight Institute, the online institute. Is that correct?
That's correct. And you can reach us either through that website, mindsightinstitute.com, or Dr. Dan Siegel, DrDanSiegel.com.
And you have a book coming out called No Drama Discipline. Is that
That's
correct?
right.
Yeah.
No Drama Discipline, I wrote with Tina Payne Bryson, my co-author also for The Whole Brain Child. And those two books are books for parents and other caregivers of children before their teenage years to really help. In this case, the discipline book, No Drama Discipline, reframes our cultural discussion of discipline and reclaims discipline as teaching, not as punishment.
Oh, I love that. I just got shivers. I love that approach to being a parent and a caregiver. And it's such a respectful, mutually respectful relationship between a child and, their parent. So love it. And so if anybody wants any more information, go to drdansiegel.com, just as Dr. Siegel has just said. Read that book. You will get tons more information than what we had just discussed here. And thank you so much, Dr. Siegel, for being here with us for the Children's and Teen Health Summit. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Carla. It's an honor.
You take good care.
You too.